After 5 years of serving the same man at the cafe, a waitress is shocked to discover his secret. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. In the heart of a suburban neighborhood nestled between tree-lined streets and cozy cottages, where the aroma of freshly baked goods mixed with the scent of blooming flowers, there was a quaint cafe called Harmony Nook. The cafe, with its rustic charm, polished wooden tables, and warm, golden light streaming in through large windows, was a place where locals gathered to enjoy a peaceful moment amidst the hustle of daily life. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, coffee, and freshly baked pastries. It was here, in this little haven, that Sarah, a cheerful barista with a magnetic presence, found her daily rhythm. Sarah had become a staple in the community. Her smile, warm and genuine, was as much a part of Harmony Nook as the espresso machine that whirred behind her. Every morning, she donned her apron with a sense of purpose, ready to serve not just coffee and scones, but a piece of herself to every person who walked through the door. Her ability to listen attentively, to genuinely care about the stories and musings shared over steaming cups of coffee, made her a favorite among regulars. The cafe was more than just a workplace for Sarah. It was a sanctuary, a place where she felt she was making a difference, no matter how small. With nimble fingers and a sharp eye, she prepared frothy lattes, warm croissants, and slices of cake that seemed to carry the essence of home. Her days were filled with little joys: the delighted giggle of a child receiving an extra chocolate chip cookie, the appreciative smile from a weary office worker grateful for a moment of respite, and the spirited conversations with Mrs. Ruth, a retired schoolteacher who never failed to bring in her worn-out copy of the morning newspaper, folded neatly under her arm. Despite the cafe's busy pace, with orders piling up and customers coming in waves, Sarah remained a calming presence. She moved with the grace of someone who had found her place in the world, her kindness and patience never wavering. To Sarah, each customer was unique, every interaction a chance to brighten someone's day. Her compassionate nature and endless patience made her not just a beloved barista but a pillar of the community. But as comfortable as her routine had become, Sarah's life was about to be upended by the arrival of a new patron, a man whose presence would introduce challenges unlike any she had faced before. Unbeknownst to her, this encounter would mark the beginning of a profound journey that would test her resilience, alter her perspective, and ultimately reveal depths of empathy she hadn't known she possessed. On a crisp autumn morning, the familiar chime of the cafe's doorbell rang out, signaling the entrance of a new customer. Sarah looked up from behind the counter and saw an elderly man with a rigid posture and a stern, almost cold expression. His presence seemed to command the space around him, as though he carried with him an aura of heaviness. He approached the counter with measured steps, his eyes sharp and unyielding, cutting through the bustling atmosphere. "Herbal tea, nothing added," he barked in a clipped tone, barely glancing at Sarah. She responded with her usual warm smile, quickly preparing the tea just as he requested. When she handed him the cup, he responded with a barely audible grunt, more a sound of acknowledgement than gratitude, and made his way to a corner seat by the window, where he sat, staring out at the passers-by. Over the next few days, the man became a regular sight at the cafe. Always at the same time, always with the same expression of disapproval etched onto his face. He chose the same seat, ordered the same tea, and seemed to find fault with every detail, whether it was the temperature of his drink or the texture of the biscuits. Sarah, ever patient, met his demands with unflappable grace. "This tea is lukewarm," he grumbled one morning, his voice laced with irritation. "Can you make sure it's hot next time?" Without missing a beat, Sarah reheated the tea, her smile never faltering as she handed it back. On another day, he scowled at the plate of biscuits. "These are too dry," he muttered. Sarah immediately replaced them with a fresh batch, her demeanor as warm as ever. For her, each interaction with Mr. Harris was more than just a service exchange. It was an exercise in understanding and a test of her ability to remain compassionate in the face of rudeness. Despite his constant complaints and critical eye, Sarah couldn't help but notice that Mr. Harris was, in many ways, a creature of habit. Every morning without fail, he arrived at precisely 10 a.m., took the same seat by the window, and followed the same routine. Over time, Sarah began to anticipate his needs, preparing his order in advance, ensuring the tea was always piping hot and the biscuits were freshly baked. As she observed him, she started to notice the little things: how he carefully adjusted his reading glasses before opening his newspaper, the meticulous way he arranged his belongings on the table, and the way he occasionally scribbled notes in a small, weathered journal. These details slowly humanized Mr. Harris for Sarah, transforming him from a difficult customer into a person with stories and struggles of his own. She began to see beyond his gruff exterior, wondering what life experiences had shaped him into the man he was now. On some days, his rigid demeanor seemed to soften slightly, as though he were making a conscious effort to be less harsh. Sarah noticed these subtle changes and felt that perhaps, in some small way, her kindness was beginning to chip away at his defenses. As the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, Mr. Harris became a fixture in Sarah's life. His presence, though challenging, added a sense of rhythm to her day. She continued to treat him with the same patience and warmth, viewing each day as an opportunity to connect, even if the connection was barely perceptible. Her colleagues, who had long since given up on trying to win over Mr. Harris, watched her persistence with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment. "Why do you go out of your way for someone like him?" one of her co-workers asked one afternoon, shaking her head in disbelief. "He's never happy with anything you do." Sarah's response was always the same. "Maybe he's never had someone who really listened or cared. Everyone has their own struggles, and maybe what he needs most is a bit of understanding." While others might have grown frustrated or disheartened by Mr. Harris's constant complaints, Sarah found a quiet strength in her interactions with him. She believed that even the smallest gestures of kindness could make a difference, even if that difference wasn't immediately visible. It was this belief that kept her from giving up, that motivated her to continue serving him with a smile, no matter how gruff his demeanor remained. Then one day everything changed. The clock struck 10 a.m., and for the first time in 5 years, Mr. Harris did not walk through the door. Sarah found herself glancing at the entrance more frequently than usual, waiting for the familiar sight of him entering the cafe with his usual frown. But as the minutes ticked by, his seat by the window remained empty. A feeling of unease settled in the pit of her stomach. Perhaps he was just running late, she told herself. But when he didn't show up the next day, or the day after that, worry began to gnaw at her. His absence left a noticeable void, not just in the daily routine, but in Sarah's heart as well. Despite his difficult nature, Mr. Harris had become an integral part of her day. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Determined to find out what had happened, she began asking around. Colleagues, regular customers, anyone who might have seen or heard from him. But no one had any information. It was as though he had simply vanished. Sarah's concern grew with each passing day. She found herself thinking about him during quiet moments, wondering if he was all right, if he was in need of help, or if something tragic had occurred. The empty seat by the window became a stark reminder that someone important was missing from her life. With no clear answers, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. In her free time, she wandered the nearby streets, visiting local shops and asking if anyone knew Mr. Harris or where he might live. Most responses were vague. A few shop owners recognized his description but knew little else about him. The search seemed hopeless, and with each dead end, Sarah's frustration grew. How could someone so regular, so consistent in their routine, disappear without a trace? Then, on a gloomy afternoon, as rain drizzled softly against the cafe windows, a man walked in carrying an envelope. He looked nervous, his eyes downcast as he approached the counter. There was something in his demeanor that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. She could sense that whatever news he brought was significant. "Are you Sarah?" he asked, his voice tinged with sorrow. "Yes, I'm Sarah," she replied, feeling her chest tighten. The man took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm Robert, Mr. Harris's son. My father passed away last week. I found this letter among his things. It's addressed to you." Sarah's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Her mind was reeling, trying to process what she had just heard. Mr. Harris was gone. The man she had served for so many years, who had become such a familiar presence in her life, was no longer there. "He always spoke highly of you," Robert continued. "I know he wasn't the easiest person to deal with, but he respected you a lot. He wanted you to have this." The words echoed in her mind as she stared at the envelope. With shaky hands, she tore it open right there at the counter, unable to wait. The letter inside was filled with words she never expected to read. Mr. Harris expressed deep gratitude for the way she had treated him, acknowledging that he knew he had been difficult. But the most shocking revelation was buried in the middle of the letter. Mr. Harris confessed that he was her biological father, a fact he had kept hidden all these years due to a strained and complicated past. The room seemed to spin as Sarah absorbed the truth. The grumpy, distant man she had served day in and day out was, in fact, her father. Memories flashed before her eyes. The complaints, the rare moments of warmth, the meticulous way he carried himself. It all made sense now, but it also opened a floodgate of emotions. Shock, anger, sadness, and a deep sense of loss. Robert, seeing the turmoil in her expression, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He had a lot of regrets. He never knew how to show it, but he cared about you more than you could imagine. I know this must be overwhelming, but I thought you should know." Sarah nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you for telling me. I wish I had known sooner." The revelation left Sarah reeling. She had spent years serving a man she thought was just another difficult customer, only to find out he was a piece of her own story, a piece she had never known was missing. She felt a strange mix of sorrow and connection, wondering what could have been if things had been different. The next day, she visited her mother, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. Her thoughts raced as she struggled to find the right words. When she arrived, she could hardly contain the flood of questions that had been building up inside her. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important," she began, her voice wavering with emotion. Her mother looked at her with concern, sensing the gravity of the situation. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Sarah handed her the letter, unable to speak as her mother read it. As she watched her mother's face change from confusion to shock, Sarah knew the truth was about to come out. "I never wanted you to find out like this," her mother said softly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I thought I was protecting you. Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke. "I had a right to know." Her mother sighed deeply, setting the letter down with trembling hands. "I was afraid it would hurt you. Your biological father and I parted ways before you were born. He wasn't in a good place back then. He had a lot of issues, and I didn't think he'd be the kind of father you deserved. When I met the man who raised you, he accepted you as his own, and I just wanted you to have a stable, happy life. But he was there, all those years. Why didn't he ever say anything?" Sarah's voice was filled with a mix of hurt and confusion. "He tried," her mother admitted. "But I didn't want him to bring chaos into your life. He had let us down so many times before. I didn't want him to break your heart too." The revelation left Sarah feeling lost. The man she had known as Mr. Harris was not just a stranger. He was someone who should have been a central figure in her life. Her mother's intentions had been protective, but they had left Sarah grappling with a hidden truth that changed everything she thought she knew. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself reflecting on the time she had spent with Mr. Harris, how every small interaction now took on a new significance. She could see the hints that had been there all along, but it was only now that she understood the full picture. The loss she felt was profound, not just for the man he had been, but for the relationship they never had. Determined to learn more, Sarah arranged to meet Robert at a nearby coffee shop. Over steaming mugs of tea, she asked him to fill in the gaps, to tell her about the man she never really knew. "My dad was complicated," Robert began, choosing his words carefully. "He carried a lot of guilt, and it weighed on him every day. But seeing you, even from a distance, brought him some kind of peace. He didn't know how to reach out after all the mistakes he made, so he kept coming to the cafe, hoping that maybe in his own way, he could be part of your life." Sarah listened intently, her heart heavy with the knowledge of what had been lost. "He cared about me," she whispered, more to herself than to Robert. "Even if he never showed it the way I expected, he cared." "More than you know," Robert replied. "He was proud of you. He just couldn't bring himself to tell you." Those words echoed in Sarah's mind as she left the cafe, a swirl of emotions churning within her. Both her mother and her father had acted out of love, even if their choices had led to a painful separation. Understanding this didn't erase the hurt, but it gave her a sense of closure, a way to reconcile the conflicting emotions she felt. Back at Harmony Nook, Sarah found herself looking at Mr. Harris's usual seat with a new perspective. She knew now that every interaction, every complaint, had been his way of staying close, of being part of her world in the only way he knew how. To honor that, she placed a small photograph of him in her locker, a quiet tribute to the man who had been both a stranger and a father. In the weeks that followed, Sarah decided to visit Mr. Harris's grave. She brought flowers and the letter he had written, and as she stood before the simple headstone, she allowed herself to cry. The tears were not just for what had been lost, but for what could never be recovered. But there was also a sense of release, of letting go of the bitterness and accepting the complexity of their story. "I forgive you," she whispered through her tears. "And I hope you forgive me too, for not knowing, for not understanding sooner." As she walked away from the grave, she felt a strange peace wash over her. The pain was still there, but so was a sense of connection, a belief that her father had tried in his flawed way to be there for her. Sarah returned to the cafe with a renewed sense of purpose. She continued to serve with the same warmth and patience, but now with a deeper understanding of how important even the smallest acts of kindness could be. She knew that spreading compassion wasn't just for others, it was for herself, a commitment to remain the person she wanted to be, no matter what life threw her way. Though the routine had changed, the lessons she had learned from her unexpected relationship with Mr. Harris remained at the core of everything she did. Every new customer who walked through the door, every challenge she faced, reminded her that kindness, no matter how small, could ripple out in ways she could never fully understand. And so, the cafe continued to be a place of warmth and connection, a place where Sarah's journey of empathy and resilience quietly carried on, one cup of tea at a time. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.